The last photo my sister ever sent me was a drawing of our house. Not the apartment I'd rented in Columbus after I swore I'd never go back to Hardin County. Not the duplex Mom moved into after the divorce. The old house. The one on Kellner Road with the wraparound porch and the oak tree Dad planted the year I was born. Nora drew it in crayon blue roof, yellow door, stick figure version of herself standing in the yard with her arms wide open, like she was trying to hug the whole property. She was 9. She still drew the sun with a smiley face. She texted it to me at 6:14 on a Tuesday evening with a single line beneath it. I made this for you because I miss you. I didn't respond. I was 3 beers into a Wednesday Eve habit I'd picked up after losing my warehouse job, and I told myself I'd reply in the morning when I could say something that didn't sound hollow. Morning came. I typed, "I love it, Nora," and stared at the words for 30 seconds before deleting them. Too little. She deserved more than 4 words from a brother who'd already missed her spring choir concert, and 2 birthdays. I told myself I'd call on the weekend. I closed the message thread and opened a job board instead. That was 14 days before the outbreak. I don't know what name they finally gave it. The emergency broadcast system called it a rapidly evolving civil health emergency. The internet called it a dozen things before the internet stopped existing. I didn't care what it was called. I watched the first cell phone videos like everyone else. Shaky footage from a hospital in Dayton. A woman in scrubs screaming about bite protocols. A parking lot full of people running from something the camera refused to focus on. I watched with the sound off because my roommate Derek was asleep on the couch and I didn't want to explain why I was doom scrolling at 1 in the morning. By dawn, the videos weren't shaky anymore. They were steady, filmed by people who'd stopped running. The footage from Springfield showed a man standing in a Kroger doorway, holding his arm where the sleeve was torn away, staring at the camera with an expression I will carry in my chest until I die. He wasn't asking for help. He was saying goodbye to whoever might eventually watch. 2 days later, Columbus started to fold. Not all at once. It crumbled at the edges like wet bread. The east side went quiet first. No sirens, no traffic. Just an absence of noise that felt louder than anything. Derek and I watched a line of military vehicles roll down East Main Street from our second-floor window. He said it looked like a parade. I said parades don't have gunners standing in the beds of Humvees. By nightfall, they'd established a perimeter from Bexley to Whitehall, and the power started cycling 40 minutes on, 20 off, 40 on, an hour off. The pattern shortened every day. I called Mom on the 3rd day. She picked up on the first ring and spoke in a voice I hadn't heard since the night Dad left. Controlled, featureless, stripped of everything except information. She was at the house on Kellner Road. She'd pulled Nora out of school 2 days early. They were fine. The town was quiet. She'd filled the bathtubs and bought canned food. She told me to stay in Columbus where the military was. She told me not to come. She said, "I love you, Marcus," with a period at the end instead of an exclamation point, and that punctuation, that flatness kept me awake for 2 consecutive nights. I called again the next day. No answer. I called 6 times the next morning, straight to voicemail. By the 5th day, cell service was a coin toss. I got a single text through to Mom's number. "Are you safe? Is Nora okay?" And the delivered receipt never appeared. It sat in my outbox like a prayer dropped into a well. Derek told me the towers were overloaded. Derek told me everyone's calls were failing. Derek told me not to panic while he packed a bag and left for his parents' place in Pittsburgh without saying goodbye. I woke up to an empty apartment and a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Sorry, bro, good luck." I sat on the floor next to the window and opened Nora's photo. The blue roof. the yellow door. Her stick-figure arms stretched wide. I left Columbus at dawn. The drive from Columbus to Kenton is 93 miles on a normal day. US 33, west through Marysville, then up through Bellefontaine and across the tableland farmscape of Logan County until the horizon flattens into that particular brand of Ohio emptiness I spent 18 years trying to escape. On a normal day, it takes an hour and 40 minutes. On the 6th day after the outbreak began, it took me 11 hours, and I didn't make it. I drove a 2011 Honda Civic with a quarter tank of gas because every station between German Village and the I-270 loop was either closed, swarmed, or burning. I took surface streets west, cutting through Hilliard on back roads I half remembered from pizza delivery shifts I'd worked in college. The suburbs looked paused rather than abandoned, garage doors open, sprinklers still running on automatic timers, a golden retriever sitting in a driveway staring at me as I rolled past at 15 miles an hour. The absence of people was the thing. Lawns without children, sidewalks without joggers, a school parking lot with the doors propped open and not a single car. The world hadn't been destroyed yet. It had been vacated. Like everyone received an invitation to leave and forgot to tell me where they went. I hit the first real blockage outside Plain City. A jackknife semi straddled both lanes of 33, and the shoulder was clogged with vehicles that had tried to squeeze through and failed. I sat behind a minivan for 20 minutes before the driver's door opened, and a woman climbed out and walked toward my car. She was mid-50s, gray-streaked ponytail, wearing a church sweatshirt. She leaned down to my window and asked where I was headed. I told her Kenton. She shook her head slowly and said everything north of Bellefontaine was dark. She said she'd heard it on a CB radio the National Guard had pulled back to the Marysville line, and everything beyond it was uncontrolled. I asked her what uncontrolled meant. She looked at me the way you look at someone who still thinks the rules apply and said, "It means nobody's coming." I turned around, found a county road that paralleled 33 to the north, a 2-lane through soybean fields so flat I could see 3 miles in every direction. The solitude was a mercy for 30 minutes. Then I came over a low rise and saw them. 4 figures on the road, standing still, not walking, not wandering. Standing in a loose cluster near an abandoned pickup truck with its driver's door open. I slowed to a crawl 200 yards out and watched. The closest one was a man in work coverall, his left arm hanging at an angle that didn't correspond to any joint. His head was tilted, chin resting almost on his collarbone, and he swayed faintly like a drunk who'd forgotten which direction he intended to fall. The second was smaller, a teenager maybe, and the third and fourth were partially blocked by the truck. None of them reacted to my engine noise. I eased the Civic onto the grassy shoulder and tried to creep past. 50 yards out, the teenager's head snapped toward me with a speed that made my hands lock on the wheel. Not a slow turn, not a curious glance. A mechanical pivot, like a turret finding a target. Then the man in coveralls turned. Then the ones behind the truck turned. 4 faces aimed at my windshield, and I understood in a single frozen second that these were not sick people. Sick people don't move their heads like that. Sick people don't begin walking toward you in perfect synchronized silence. I floored it. The Civic fishtailed on the grass, caught asphalt, and I blew past them doing 60 on a road rated for 45. In the rearview mirror, the man in coveralls was running. Not shambling. Running. He covered the ground with a lurching, mechanical stride that was faster than it should have been, and he didn't stop when I pulled away. He just kept running until the road curved and the corn swallowed him. I pulled over a mile later and threw up on the shoulder. My hands didn't stop shaking for an hour. I sat in the car with the engine running and the doors locked and stared at the cornfield and understood with total clarity that the world I'd been living in no longer existed. The old world had rules. This one had teeth. I checked my phone. No signal. Nora's drawing stared up at me from the lock screen where I'd saved it. I put the car in drive and kept moving north. I ran out of gas 4 miles south of Bellefontaine, coasting to a stop on a county road between a harvested cornfield and a drainage ditch. The engine coughed twice and died, and the silence that replaced it was so total it had a physical quality, like pressure against the eardrums. I sat behind the wheel and calculated. Kenton was still 40 miles northwest. I had a backpack with 2 water bottles, a box of granola bars, a folding knife I'd bought at a gas station 2 years ago, and a phone with 11% battery and no signal. 40 miles on foot through territory the woman in the church sweatshirt had called uncontrolled. I walked. The first 3 miles were just walking. Fields on both sides, sky enormous and indifferent, my sneakers slapping pavement in a rhythm that became hypnotic. I stayed on the center line because the shoulders dropped into ditches deep enough to twist an ankle, and because the open sight lines gave me comfort. Nothing could sneak up on me out here. That's what I told myself. I told myself a lot of things during those first 3 miles. I told myself Mom's phone died. I told myself Nora was drawing pictures at the kitchen table. I told myself the military would restore order any day. I told myself stories because the alternative was admitting that I was a 24-year-old unemployed warehouse worker walking into an active outbreak zone with a folding knife and no plan. The town of Zanesfield appeared around mile 4, a cluster of maybe 40 houses gathered around a crossroads with a church and a volunteer fire station. I approached from the south, keeping to the road, and stopped when I saw the barricade. Someone had pushed 2 pickup trucks, nose to nose, across the main intersection, and behind them I could see stacked furniture, wooden pallets, what looked like a section of chain-link fence wired to a stop sign. It was crude but deliberate. Someone had built this with intention. A man appeared on the roof of the fire station. He was carrying a deer rifle, and he raised one hand in a gesture that could have been a greeting or a warning. I stopped and raised both of mine. "Just passing through," I called. "Heading north to Kenton." He studied me for a long time. Then he climbed on a ladder I couldn't see and walked to the barricade. He was in his 60s, weathered and lean, wearing a flannel jacket and a feed cap. He looked at me through a gap in the chain link with eyes that were tired but steady. "Kenton's gone," he said. The word hit my sternum like a fist. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean the guard pulled out 3 days ago and nobody's heard anything since. Power's out, no radio traffic. A guy came through yesterday on a motorcycle and said the whole downtown was overrun." He paused. "You got people there?" "My mother, my little sister." He looked at the ground. The rifle shifted on his shoulder. "How old's the sister? 9? He exhaled through his nose and shook his head, not a refusal, just the involuntary gesture of a man absorbing information he wished he hadn't received. He told me his name was Bill Kessler, and he'd been the fire chief here for 22 years. He told me Zanesfield had 18 people left out of 106. He told me they'd lost the east side of the village 2 nights ago when a group of infected came through a cornfield at 3 in the morning and got into a house before anyone heard the screaming. "You can't walk to Kenton," he said. "Not on the roads. They drift towards sound. They cluster near vehicles. A man on foot, on open asphalt, is a dinner bell." "Then how?" He looked northwest, toward the tree line that bordered the Scioto River headwaters. "The creek bottoms. They don't go near running water. I don't know if it's the sound or the feel of it or what, but they avoid it. Every encounter we've had, they stay 20, 30 feet from any moving stream." This was the first useful intelligence I'd received since Columbus. I asked him to repeat it. He did. and added that a family had escaped from West Liberty 2 days ago by wading down Buck Creek for 6 miles. They arrived soaking wet and hypothermic, but untouched. Bill gave me a road map of Logan County, a bottle of ibuprofen, and a can of beef stew. He pointed to a blue vein on the map, the Mad River tributary that snaked northwest toward the Hardin County line. He said if I stayed in or near the creek bed, I might make it. He said might with the careful pronunciation of a man who didn't want to carry my optimism on his conscience. I thanked him. He nodded and said, "Bring your sister south if you find her. We got room." If. The word sat in my throat like a stone. The creek bottom was a world unto itself. Below the sight line of the fields, the terrain dropped into a trough of sycamores, river birch, and knotted underbrush that closed overhead like a tunnel. The water was shallow, ankle-deep in most places, knee-deep where the channel narrowed, and cold enough to make my feet ache within the first half-mile. I walked in the stream itself, following Bill's advice literally, letting the current push against my shins while the canopy filtered the late afternoon light into shifting green patterns that under different circumstances might have been beautiful. The noise of the water was a companion in a mask. It covered my footsteps, but also covered everything else. Every 100 yards I'd stop, hold my breath, and listen for sounds that didn't belong. Birdsong was sporadic. Once a deer crashed through the underbrush 30 feet to my left, and I dropped to a crouch so fast I submerged my backpack. My heart was a trapped animal in my chest for 5 minutes afterwards. But the creek stayed clear. Nothing came near the water. I traveled 4 hours before dark, covering what I estimated was 8 miles based on the map's scale. The terrain rose and fell in gentle corrugations, remnants of glacial activity that gave Logan County its subtle topography, and the creek followed the lowest contour with the patient logic of water. As the light faded, I climbed the east bank and found a sycamore with a trunk wide enough to sit against, positioned where I could see 50 yards in 3 directions. I ate the beef stew cold from the can and drank half a water bottle and watched the sky turn from amber to violet to black. I didn't sleep. I want to be clear about that because later people asked me how I slept during the journey, and the answer is I didn't. Not that night. I sat against that tree with the folding knife open in my lap, and I listened to the darkness make sounds I couldn't identify. Rustling. Distant cracks. Once something that might have been a voice carried on the wind from the northwest, too far away to parse into words, too structured to be an animal. I pressed my back against the bark and watched the tree line and negotiated silently with whatever governed the universe to let my sister be alive. The negotiation was selfish. I knew that even then. I wasn't asking for the world to be saved. I wasn't asking for the outbreak to end. I was asking for one 9-year-old girl to still be breathing in a house on Kellner Road, and I was offering nothing in return except the willingness to walk into whatever was waiting for me. That's not bravery, that's transaction. I wanted to feel like I was doing something after years of doing nothing, and Nora's survival was the currency that would purchase my redemption. I'm not proud of that framing, but I promised this would be honest. Dawn arrived slowly, a gray seepage that turned the creek bottom into a charcoal sketch. I refilled my water bottles from the stream, a risk, but dehydration was a certainty and giardia was a maybe, and started walking again. The map told me I was approaching the Hardin County line. The terrain began to change. The creek widened and the banks lowered and the tree cover thinned until I was walking through open pasture lands with only the stream bed for concealment. I crouched lower, moved slower, stopped more frequently to scan. At mid-morning, I found the first sign of Kenton's collapse. A Hardin County sheriff's cruiser sat in a field 200 yards from the creek, both doors open, light bar still cycling in a weak, battery-drained pulse. Red, blue, red, blue. A metronome marking time for nobody. There were no bodies. There was no damage to the vehicle. It looked like the officer had simply stopped, opened both doors, and walked away from everything the car represented. I pressed forward. The creek fed into a larger waterway, the Scioto River proper. Though this far upstream, it was barely 30 feet across. I followed it northwest, and the landscape began to assemble itself into something I recognized. A water tower in the distance. The steeple of First Methodist. The radio mast on top of the county courthouse. Kenton, 5 miles out. Still standing, at least in silhouette. I didn't feel relief. I felt the specific terror of proximity, the understanding that the next few hours would deliver an answer I might not survive receiving. I reached the outskirts of Kenton at early afternoon, approaching from the southeast along the Scioto's banks. The river curved behind the industrial strip, a grain elevator, a farm equipment dealer, the empty husk of a Walmart distribution center, and I used these structures as waypoints, moving building to building with the water always within sprinting distance. Bill's intelligence held. The infected eye spotted 3 of them, milling in the distribution center's loading dock, like workers waiting for a shift that would never start, stayed well clear of the riverbank. I passed within 100 yards and none of them turned. The town itself was worse than empty. Empty would have been clean. Kenton was interrupted. Traffic lights cycling through their colors for intersections nobody would ever cross again. A dog tied to a parking meter, alive, barking at nothing in a hoarse and exhausted loop. Grocery bags scattered across a Walgreens parking lot. Their contents diapers, soup cans, a package of birthday candles spread in a trail that told the story of someone who ran and dropped everything. I cataloged these details because they were evidence, and because focusing on evidence kept me from focusing on the dread that was building in my chest like water behind a dam. Kellner Road was on the north side of town. To get there, I had to cross the commercial district, 4 blocks of Main Street storefronts, the county courthouse, the library. I left the river, which was the hardest decision I'd made since leaving Columbus, and moved through the alley behind the IGA grocery store with my knife in my hand and my pulse in my ears. I heard them before I saw them. A wet, a rhythmic shuffling, like someone dragging a heavy bag across concrete. I pressed against the brick wall of the IGA and peered around the corner. 2 infected stood in the middle of Main Street. One had been a woman, I could tell from the remnant of a floral blouse, and the other was large, male, wearing the khaki uniform of the county sheriff's department. They weren't moving with purpose. They occupied space with a vacant, tidal energy, drifting 3 steps in one direction, pausing, drifting back. Their heads made that slow, oscillating sweep I'd seen on the highways, scanning, sampling, waiting for stimulus. I pulled back, controlled my breathing, plotted a route through the alley that would take me north without crossing Main Street. I found it a narrow passage between the IGA and a hardware store that opened onto a residential street. I moved through it silently, heel to toe, the way I'd seen hunters walk in the woods behind our house when I was a kid, and thought the world was a place where the worst thing that could happen was a missed shot. The residential streets were quieter. Most houses were sealed, curtains drawn, doors closed, the studied blankness of structures whose occupants had either fled or decided that invisibility was survival. A few showed signs of forced entry. One had a window shattered from the inside, glass scattered outward onto the porch, and I didn't look at what was on the porch beyond the glass. I turned onto Kellner Road at approximately 2 in the afternoon. I recognized it by the curve and the drainage ditch, and the way the oaks arched overhead to form a canopy that in autumn dropped leaves thick enough to rake for hours. Our house was the fourth on the left. I could see it from the corner, the wraparound porch, the oak tree Dad planted, the detached garage with the basketball hoop I'd begged for at 12. The front door was closed. The windows were intact. Mom's Subaru was in the driveway, and from the outside the house looked exactly as it had the day I left for Columbus 4 years ago. I crossed the lawn, climbed the porch steps, put my hand on the door handle, and felt the metal warm from the sun, and understood that the next 30 seconds would become the dividing line of my life. Everything before this door, everything after. I turned the handle. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open. The living room was organized. That was the first thing I registered. Not ransacked and not disturbed organized. The furniture had been rearranged. The couch and both armchairs were pushed against the far wall. The coffee table was gone. The center of the room was open space, and on the hardwood floor someone had drawn a large circle in what looked like sidewalk chalk blue. The same blue from Nora's crayons, and inside the circle were objects arranged with deliberate precision. Canned food, water bottles, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a kitchen knife, a stuffed rabbit I recognized as Mr. Buttons, Nora's companion since age 3. This was not the work of an adult. I stood in the doorway of my childhood living room and tried to reconcile what I was seeing with what I'd expected to find. I'd prepared myself for horror. I'd steeled myself for emptiness. I had not prepared myself for organization. The chalk circle was approximately 6 feet in diameter, drawn with the careful, pressured strokes of a child who was concentrating very hard. Inside it, the supplies were sorted cans on the left, water on the right, medical supplies at the top, tools at the bottom. Cardinal directions, I realized. She'd oriented them like a compass. The kitchen knife was positioned at the circle's exact center, blade pointing toward the front door. "Nora?" My voice cracked on the second syllable. The sound filled the house and came back to me, shaped by the empty hallway and the staircase and the silence. No answer. I moved through the living room into the kitchen. More chalk green this time, marking the floor in lines that led from the back door to the pantry to the sink. Pathways. She'd drawn pathways on the floor like a map of her own movements. The pantry door was open, and inside, the shelves had been reorganized at the lower levels. Everything above 4 feet was untouched. Mom's baking supplies, the slow cooker, the holiday dishes. Everything below 4 feet was sorted with the same meticulous logic. Soups together, vegetables together, fruit together. Each group had a chalk tally mark on the shelf inventory counts, updated in different colors that I suspected represented different days. The refrigerator was closed but unpowered. A note on it, written in crayon on construction paper, read, "Do not open. Smells bad. Day 4. Below it, another note. Water from sink works if you push handle up hard. I checked the sink. The faucet produced a thin, stuttering stream, gravity-fed from the municipal tower, probably the last of the pressure. Enough for a child who knew to use it sparingly. I went upstairs. The hallway was dim. All the doors were closed except one. Nora's room. I pushed it open and found her bed made with military precision, the comforter pulled tight, and the pillow centered. On the nightstand, a crayon journal, loose sheets of construction paper, stapled together with entries dated by day number rather than calendar date. I picked it up and read the first page. Day 1. Mom said stay inside. I am staying inside. Mom went to check on Mrs. Abel next door. She said she would come back. I am waiting. Page 2. Day 2. Mom did not come back. I looked out the window. I saw Mrs. Abel walking funny in her yard. I did not open the door. Page 3. Day 3. The power went off. I found the flashlight in the junk drawer. I ate cereal with no milk. I moved the cans down so I can reach them. Page 4. Day 4. I heard noises in Mrs. Abel's house. I closed all the curtains. I drew the circle. Mr. Buttons is in the circle because the circle is the safe place. I read 12 more pages. Each one was a day. Each one was written in the careful, round handwriting of a third grader documenting her own survival, with the only tools she understood: crayons, chalk, and the rigid logic of a child who believes that if you follow the rules precisely enough, the world will keep its promises. She never wrote about being scared. Not once. She wrote about inventory. She wrote about the weather she could see through the curtains. She wrote about the sounds outside and categorized them. Bird sounds, wind sounds, bad sounds. She developed a system. Days with no bad sounds got a green star. Days with bad sounds got a red X. The last 4 pages all had red X's. The final page was today's date by her count day 14. It read, "I think someone is coming. I heard a car on the big road. I am going to the basement because the basement is the deepest and deepest is safest. If you are reading this and you are not sick, I am in the basement. Knock 3 times so I know." I set down the journal, walked to the basement door in the hallway, raised my fist. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, silence. Then from below a small voice. "Who is it?" "It's Marcus," I said, and my throat closed around the name like a fist. "It's your brother." A pause that lasted a geological age. Then the sound of small footsteps on wooden stairs, and the door opened, and Nora stood there. She didn't run to me. That was the first thing that broke something inside my chest. The Nora, I remembered the Nora who tackled me at the knees every time I walked through the front door, who climbed me like a tree and demanded to be carried on my shoulders, that Nora would have launched herself across the threshold. This Nora stood in the basement doorway and studied me, with an expression that belonged on someone 3 times her age. She held a flashlight in one hand and a screwdriver in the other, and she looked at my face, then my hands, then my arms, then my face again. "Are you bitten?" she asked. The question was clinical, procedural. She'd rehearsed it. "No," I said. "I'm not bitten. I'm not sick. I walked here from Columbus." She processed this. I watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. Not the emotional calculus of reunion, but the practical assessment of a new variable entering her system. Then something shifted. The screwdriver lowered. The flashlight beam moved off my face. Her lower lip trembled once, a single, involuntary quiver, and she stepped forward and pressed her forehead against my stomach and stood there without wrapping her arms around me, just leaning, transferring weight, like a structure that had been holding itself upright for 2 weeks and was testing whether it was safe to redistribute the load. I put my hand on the back of her head and held it there. Her hair was tangled and unwashed. She smelled like canned soup and crayons and the particular mustiness of a basement. She was alive. She was alive, and I couldn't speak for 2 full minutes because every word I might have said was trapped behind a wall of something I didn't have a name for. When she stepped back, her face was composed again. "I need to show you the system," she said. "The system? I built a system. For staying alive, I'll show you." She led me through the house with the purposeful stride of a museum docent, explaining each element as we encountered it. The chalk circle in the living room was the emergency rally point. If something got inside, she would grab the supplies in the circle and retreat to the basement through a specific route marked in green chalk. The pathways in the kitchen were her daily movement patterns, designed to minimize time spent near windows. The inventory tallies were updated every morning. She'd calculated her consumption rate and determined she had enough food for 22 more days if she ate 2 meals instead of 3. She was 9. She was standing in our mother's kitchen explaining caloric rationing with the composure of a logistics officer. "Where's Mom?" I asked. Nora's face didn't change. "She went to Mrs. Abel's house on day 1. She said she'd be right back. She wasn't right back." A pause. "On day 3, I saw someone in Mrs. Abel's yard that looked like Mom but didn't move like Mom. I closed the curtain." She delivered this information with the same tone she'd used to explain the chalk pathways. Flat, organized, filed under a category she'd already processed and shelved. I understood then that she hadn't avoided feeling the grief, she'd systematized it. Compartmentalized it into something she could manage alongside the canned food inventory and the daily weather observations. She'd survived by turning her fear into procedure. The basement was her masterwork. She'd dragged a mattress down the stairs, how, at her size, I couldn't fathom, and positioned it in the corner farthest from the 2 small windows. The windows themselves were covered with black garbage bags and duct tape from the inside. A bucket in the opposite corner served as a bathroom, lined with plastic bags she replaced from a supply she'd found under the kitchen sink. The flashlight had backup batteries organized by size on a shelf. A wind-up alarm clock from where, I don't know, sat next to the mattress, set to 6 a.m. "I go to sleep at 8 and wake up at 6, she said. "I don't go upstairs when it's dark." I looked at the alarm clock, the batteries in their neat row, the mattress with its tucked corners. I looked at my 9-year-old sister who had built a functioning survival infrastructure inside our childhood home using the cognitive tools of a 4th grader. Chalk, routine, rules, and the unshakable belief that order could hold chaos at bay. I wanted to tell her she was the bravest person I'd ever met. I wanted to tell her I was sorry I didn't answer her text. I wanted to tell her everything was going to be okay. Instead, I said, "Show me the rest." Because she needed me to take her system seriously. She needed me to see it not as a child's coping mechanism, but as the architecture of her survival. And I was beginning to understand that it was exactly that. The rest of her system extended beyond the house. This was what I hadn't expected. She took me to the 2nd-floor hallway window, the one that overlooked the backyard, and beyond the fence, Mrs. Abel's property and the 2 houses flanking it. She'd taped a piece of poster board to the wall beside the window, and on it she'd drawn a map. Not a child's imaginary treasure map. A functional overhead diagram of the 5 nearest properties, with X's marking locations where she'd observed infected, and numbers indicating how many she'd seen at each point. The diagram was annotated in her careful handwriting. Mrs. Abel's porch. 2 mostly stay there. Big white house. 1 walks around the yard in circles. House with broken windows, sometimes 1, sometimes 0. She'd been conducting surveillance. For 14 days, she'd watched from this window at specific times, morning and late afternoon, she told me, because that's when they moved the most and recorded their patterns. "The ones at Mrs. Abel's don't leave the porch unless they hear something loud," she said, pointing to the X. I tested it. I dropped a book out the bathroom window on the other side of the house, and they both walked toward the sound. They came back after about 10 minutes. "You tested it?" "I needed to know how they work." I stared at the poster board. She'd drawn arrows indicating movement patterns she'd observed. She'd noted times of day in different colored crayons. She'd created a functional behavioral study of the infected within her observable radius using materials from her art supply bin. "The one at the big white house is slow," she continued. "I think something is wrong with his legs. He falls down sometimes and takes a long time to get up. The one at the broken window house comes and goes. I think he walks a big loop around the block. He shows up around lunchtime and leaves before dark. I sat down on the hallway floor because my legs felt unreliable. Nora, how did you figure all this out? She looked at me with genuine confusion, as though the question didn't make sense. I watched. And that's how you learn things. You watch, and you write it down. Mrs. Patterson taught us that in science. She called it observation. Mrs. Patterson, third grade science. My sister had applied elementary school scientific method to apocalyptic survival and arrived at actionable intelligence that matched what Bill Kessler, a 60-year-old fire chief with decades of emergency experience, had told me about the infected's behavior. She showed me one more thing. In the garage, which she accessed through the interior door, never the exterior, she'd assembled what she called her outside bag. A school backpack containing water bottles, granola bars, the first aid kit from the bathroom, a rain poncho, and a hand-drawn map of the route from our house to the elementary school, which she'd identified as a potential secondary shelter because it has a cafeteria with food and the doors lock from inside. I was going to go there if the house stopped being safe, she said. But I hadn't decided yet. Why not? Because I hadn't finished watching. I don't know what's between here and there. I only know what I can see from the window. This was the moment I understood that I had not come to rescue my little sister. I had come carrying the narrative of the heroic older brother, the one who braves the wasteland to save the helpless child, and that narrative was dissolving in front of me like sugar in water. Nora wasn't helpless. Nora had done something I hadn't managed in 6 days of panic and reaction. She'd stopped, observed, cataloged, and built. She hadn't run. She hadn't frozen. She'd applied the only framework she had, the structured, rule-based world of a third-grade classroom. And it had kept her alive while adults with cars and guns and experience had failed. I didn't say any of this. I said, "Your system is solid. We're going to use it." Her eyes widened slightly. Not with relief, with validation. Someone had finally looked at what she'd built and confirmed that it was real. "But we can't stay here forever," I added. "There's a place south of here, a town called Zanesfield. A man named Bill has a group. He said we could come." "How far?" "About 40 miles. We'd follow the creeks." She absorbed this. "Because they don't go near water." I blinked. "How did you know that?" She pointed to the poster board. In the bottom corner, underlined twice in red crayon. "Rain day, nobody outside. All gone until rain stops." She'd figured it out independently. 9 years old, watching from a window with crayons. We spent the rest of that day and the full next morning preparing. Nora approached departure, planning the way she'd approached everything else methodically, with lists. She produced a sheet of paper divided into columns: need, have, get. The first column listed water, food, first aid, light, warmth, something to carry it in. The second column checked off items from her existing supply. The third column identified gaps. We needed more water capacity. We needed warmer clothing for creek travel. We needed something better than a folding knife and a screwdriver for protection. I searched the house. Dad's old closet, the one Mom never cleared out, either from grief or inertia, yielded a Carhartt jacket. A pair of work boots, 2 sizes too large for me, but manageable with double socks, and a camping hatchet I'd forgotten existed. In the garage, I found a tarp, bungee cords, and 2 empty gallon jugs I could fill from the sputtering faucet. Nora packed her school backpack with the same systematic precision she'd applied to everything else, placing heavier items at the bottom, distributing weight evenly, tucking Mr. Buttons into the top flap where he wouldn't be crushed. "Huh? Mr. Buttons has to come," she said. And it was the first moment she sounded like a 9-year-old instead of a 40-year-old emergency planner. "Mr. Buttons comes," I confirmed. We left at dawn on what Nora's journal designated Day 16. She'd added a final entry the night before. I didn't read it, and she showed it to me weeks later. It said, Day 15. Marcus came. He is real and not sick. We are leaving tomorrow. I am bringing Mr. Buttons and my outside bag and my map. I am not bringing the chalk because we won't need a system in the new place. Marcus is my system now. That line would redraw the architecture of my understanding for reasons I couldn't yet fathom. The route out of town was the problem. We needed to reach the Scioto River on the southeast side, but between our house and the river lay the entire width of residential Kenton. 12 blocks of streets that Nora's surveillance hadn't covered. I had the path I'd used coming in, but I'd traveled it alone and fast. Moving with a child would be different. Slower, louder, more visible. Nora solved it. She'd spent enough mornings at the window to know that the infected in her observable zone were least active in the hour after dawn. Something about the light transition, she theorized, though she admitted she wasn't sure. She proposed we leave at first light, move south through the backyards rather than the streets, using fences as concealment, and cutting through properties she'd watched and confirmed were unoccupied. We moved out at 5:47 a.m. The morning was cool and gray, dew heavy on the grass, the world holding its breath in that particular pre-dawn suspension where sound carries differently farther, cleaner, more dangerous. Nora walked behind me at a distance of exactly 4 feet. She'd decided this distance the night before, reasoning that it was close enough to maintain visual contact, but far enough that if something grabbed me, she'd have time to react. She'd explained this rationale calmly. I'd agreed because she was right. The first 3 blocks were clear. We moved through backyards, climbing fences, skirting swing sets, and garden sheds, and above-ground pools still holding their chemical blue water. Nora moved with a natural quietness that I envied. My boots seemed to find every twig and gravel patch, while she flowed over surfaces like something that had practiced. I realized she'd probably spent hours moving silently through the house, training herself without knowing that's what she was doing. Routine becomes rehearsal, becomes skill. At the 4th block, we encountered our first problem. The yard we needed to cross was occupied, not by infected, by a dog, a large mixed breed, chained to a clothesline pole, very much alive and very much alert. It saw us the moment we crested the fence and began barking with the full-throated urgency of an animal that hadn't seen a human in 2 weeks and couldn't decide if it was excited or terrified. The sound was enormous in the morning quiet. Nora didn't freeze. She pointed left a narrow gap between the house and its detached garage and moved. I followed. We squeezed through the gap and emerged on the street, exposed for the first time. And I looked both directions and saw a movement 2 blocks east. A figure rounding a corner with that distinctive lurching gait. Then another behind it. The dog's barking had carried. "Run," Nora said. Not a scream, a command. We ran. Nora was fast. That surprised me not because I doubted her physically, but because the backpack should have slowed her and it didn't. She ran with her arms pumping and her chin tucked and her feet striking the pavement in quick, efficient strides that covered ground without wasting energy. I ran beside her, the hatchet banging against my thigh, the gallon jugs in my pack sloshing with every step. And I watched her face and saw no panic in it. Concentration. The same expression she wore when she was drawing. We covered 2 blocks south before I risked a look behind us. The figures had reached the barking dog's yard and stalled there, drawn by the louder, more persistent stimulus. The dog's frenzy was pulling their attention like a magnet, and I felt a sickening pulse of gratitude followed immediately by guilt. The dog was saving us, and we couldn't save it. "Don't look," Nora said without turning around. "Looking slows you down." I faced forward and kept running. We reached the commercial district's southern edge, and I recognized the grain elevator that marked the Scioto's proximity. 3 more blocks. The street was empty here, warehouses and light industrial buildings that had been vacant even before the outbreak. Our footsteps echoed against corrugated metal walls, and every echo felt like a beacon. But nothing emerged from the doorways, and nothing stirred behind the clouded windows. The river appeared behind the grain elevator like an old friend, brown, unhurried, indifferent to catastrophe. I led Nora down the embankment to the water's edge, and the moment her shoes touched the wet stones, she stopped running. She didn't collapse or pant theatrically. She stopped, stood straight, and looked at the water with the satisfied expression of someone who'd confirmed a hypothesis. "It works," she said. "They really don't come near it." "You believed it?" "I believe my data, but data without testing is just a guess." I want to stress that she was 9. She was standing on a riverbank in the aftermath of everything, wearing a backpack decorated with cartoon unicorns, holding a stuffed rabbit by the ear, and discussing the difference between hypothesis and confirmed result. I say this not to make her sound precocious or cute. She wasn't being cute. She was being precise, and precision had been the difference between her survival and the alternative. We entered the water. The cold was a physical blow May in Ohio. The Scioto still carrying snowmelt memory, the temperature settling into our bones with patient cruelty. Nora gasped once, then adjusted. She hiked her backpack higher on her shoulders to keep it above the waterline and began walking upstream with a grim determination that I matched step for step. The first mile was the hardest. The river bottom was uneven mud, gravel, sudden drops into pools that hit mid-thigh, and the current, though gentle, pushed against us with constant low-grade resistance. Nora fell twice. The first time she caught herself on her hands and came up with muddy palms and a tight jaw. The second time she went down fully, submerging for a terrifying half-second before I hauled her up by the backpack strap. She came up sputtering, Mr. Button soaked and dripping, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something fracture behind her composure. "He's wet," she said, looking at the rabbit. Her voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. "He'll dry," I said. "We'll dry him when we stop." She looked at Mr. Buttons for a long moment. Then she tucked him inside her jacket against her chest, zipped the jacket over him, and resumed walking. The tremor disappeared, filed away, compartmentalized. Another data point absorbed into the system. By late morning, we'd covered what I estimated was 5 miles. The landscape had shifted from Kenton's outskirts to open agricultural land fields of winter wheat on both sides, the river cutting a shallow valley between them. We walked in the water, cold past feeling, our feet numb stumps that found footing through memory rather than sensation. Twice I saw figures in the distant fields, silhouettes against the wheat, standing with that terrible stillness, but they were hundreds of yards away and showed no awareness of our passage. Nora noticed them too. 2 o'clock, she said quietly, using a directional system. She'd apparently learned from a movie or a book. Standing still, probably dormant. Dormant? That's what I call it when they stop moving. They do it sometimes, like they're waiting for input. I looked at my sister. She looked at the field. We kept walking. The rain started just after noon, a slow, cold, persistent drizzle that would have been miserable under any circumstances and was actively dangerous in our current state. Already soaked from the river, the additional moisture pushed us toward hypothermia with quiet efficiency. Nora's lips turned blue within the first hour. I pulled the tarp from my pack and wrapped it around both of us, creating a shuffling 2-person tent that trapped our meager body heat and kept the worst of the rain off our cores. We couldn't stop. Stopping meant cooling further. Movement was survival, even when every step was a negotiation between numb legs and treacherous footing. I talked to keep Nora engaged, asked about school, about her teacher, about the drawing she'd sent me. She answered in short, energy-conserving sentences that gradually lengthened as she warmed to the topic of Mrs. Patterson's science class. She taught us about ecosystems, Nora said, how everything connects, the producers and the consumers and the decomposers. She said if you remove one piece, the whole thing changes. Smart teacher. She said humans think they're at the top, but they're just another piece. A pause. I think maybe something knocked our piece out. I didn't have a response to that, so I focused on the river bottom and tried not to think about how accurately a 9-year-old had just summarized the collapse of civilization. The rain brought one benefit. The infected vanished. Not reduced, vanished. The fields were empty. The roads we crossed were clear. Whatever about water repelled them, the rain amplified it into a perimeter that extended as far as I could see. We moved faster without the need for constant vigilance, covering 3 miles in an hour, and I stored this information alongside the creek data and Nora's rain day observation. Water was the key. Moving water, falling water, any water. We encountered the bridge at mile 9. A 2-lane county road crossing the Scioto, concrete and rusted guardrails, unremarkable in every way except for what was on it. A vehicle, a white pickup truck, sat in the middle of the bridge with its hood up and steam no longer rising from the engine. Beside it, sitting on the guardrail with a shotgun across his knees, was a man watching us approach. He saw us before we saw him. By the time I registered his presence, he'd already shifted the shotgun into a ready position, not aimed, but available. I stopped. Nora stopped behind me. "Who are you?" the man called. His voice was young, mid-20s, strained. "My name's Marcus. This is my sister Nora. We're heading south to Zanesfield." He studied us. The rain ran off his ball cap in a steady stream. "You're walking in the river. They don't go near water." A flicker of something, recognition, confirmation crossed his face. "Yeah, I figured that out too." He shifted on the guardrail. "Truck threw a rod 6 hours ago. I have been sitting here since. Nothing's come near the bridge on account of the river underneath, but I can't stay here forever." His name was Thomas. He was 26, a second-year veterinary student from Ohio State who'd been driving north to find his girlfriend in Findlay when the truck died. He was lean and angular, with dark circles under his eyes and the jumpy energy of someone who hadn't slept in days. The shotgun belonged to his grandfather. He had 9 shells left. Nora assessed him the way she'd assessed me at the basement door, hands, arms, face, looking for signs. Then she said, "You can come with us if you're not bitten." Tomas blinked. "I'm not bitten." "Show your arms." He looked at me. I shrugged. He rolled up both sleeves and showed clean skin. Nora nodded once, a curt, professional gesture of clearance, and Tomas joined our group with the slightly dazed expression of a man who'd just been vetted by a child and found acceptable. We moved as 3 now, back in the river. The tarp expanded to cover Nora in the middle, with Tomas and me on either side. The rain continued its steady protective curtain. Tomas walked with the careful steps of someone unused to river travel, but he learned fast. And the shotgun, now the most powerful tool in our possession, rode in his hands with a competence that told me his grandfather had taught him more than just ownership. By mid-afternoon, the rain began to thin. The protective curtain frayed, and with it, our margin of safety. We were still 20 miles from Zanesfield, and the light was already tilting toward the amber wavelengths that preceded evening. We needed shelter. Nora pointed to a structure ahead, a concrete pumping station, where a tributary joined the Scioto, a squat, windowless building with a heavy steel door. "There," she said. "No windows means nothing can see inside. One door means one entry to watch. She was right again. The pumping station was dry, dark, and cold, but it was defensible. Tomas and I wedged the steel door shut with a section of pipe we found inside, and Nora conducted her standard assessment: entry points, exits, sightlines, resources. The building contained rusted mechanical equipment, a concrete floor, and nothing else. No food, no water, no comfort. But the walls were thick and the door was steel and the river roared 10 feet away like a moat. We ate. Nora distributed canned food from her pack with the measured portioning of someone who'd been counting calories for 2 weeks. 1 can of chicken noodle soup split 3 ways, a granola bar each, water from the jugs, rationed to half a bottle per person. Tomas contributed a package of beef jerky he'd been hoarding, and Nora accepted it with a solemn nod and filed it into her mental inventory. Mr. Buttons was laid on a pipe to dry. Nora positioned him carefully, ensuring adequate airflow around his stuffing, and said nothing about it. The gesture carried more tenderness than anything else I'd witnessed from her since arriving. In the dark of the pumping station, wrapped in the tarp, Tomas told us about Findlay. He'd gotten within 10 miles before the roads became impassable, not from infected, but from abandoned vehicles, thousands of them. A solid wall of metal that stretched to the horizon. People had tried to flee north toward Toledo, and the highway had become a graveyard of stalled machines. He'd turned back. His girlfriend hadn't answered her phone in 9 days. "I keep calling," he said. "I know the towers are down. I know it's pointless. But I keep calling because if I stop, it means I've decided she's dead, and I'm not ready to decide that." Nora, who I'd assumed was asleep, spoke from beneath the tarp. "You don't have to decide. You just have to not know. Not knowing is okay." Tomas and I sat in the silence that followed and let a 9-year-old's philosophy settle around us like the dark. She was right. She'd been living in the state of not knowing for 2 weeks, not knowing about Mom, not knowing about the outside world, not knowing if anyone was coming. She hadn't resolved that uncertainty. She'd made it habitable. She'd furnished it with chalk circles and canned food inventories and the daily practice of observation. She'd proven that you could survive inside not knowing if you gave it structure. I think that was the moment the transformation began. Not a dramatic epiphany, but a quiet, tectonic shift in my understanding of competence and authority. I was the adult. Tomas was the adult with the gun. Nora was the child we were ostensibly protecting. And yet the operational hierarchy had inverted without anyone announcing it. Nora's system, her methodology of observation, documentation, and rule-based action was the framework we were all operating within. She hadn't seized control. She'd simply been the one who built something that worked, and in the absence of anything better, we'd adopted it. This is what I mean when I say what I found changed me. I didn't find a traumatized child who needed saving. I found a person small, young, armed with crayons and logic, who had done what I'd spent 6 days failing to do. She'd faced the new world without flinching, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd found a methodology for processing fear into action. I had driven, walked, run, and reacted. She had observed, categorized, planned, and built. The difference was the difference between surviving and living. I lay awake that night listening to the river outside the steel walls and understanding that I had not come to Kenton to save my sister. I had come to Kenton to be taught by her. The lesson wasn't over. Dawn inside the pumping station was indistinguishable from night. Nora's wind-up alarm marked 6 o'clock with a tinny bell that echoed off the concrete walls, and we rose in darkness, ate in darkness, and prepared to move in darkness. The routine was Nora's. She'd transported her system from the house on Kellner Road to this temporary shelter without modification. And Thomas and I followed it because it worked. and because following it was easier than inventing an alternative. We opened the steel door to a morning that was clear and cold. The rain had passed overnight, and the river ran high and brown with runoff, its surface textured by debris branches, leaves, a plastic lawn chair spinning in a lazy eddy. The sky was enormous and pale and empty of aircraft for the 14th consecutive day, which was its own kind of information. The plan was straightforward. Continue south along the Scioto, covering the remaining 20 miles to Zanesfield. At our pace, factoring in Nora's shorter stride and the energy deficit from inadequate food, I estimated 12 hours of travel. We'd arrive after dark if we moved without major stops. We entered the water. The cold was familiar now, not less painful, but expected, categorized, another variable in Nora's system that had been accounted for and accepted. Tomas walked point with the shotgun. I walked rear, and Nora moved between us, her unicorn backpack riding high, mister. Buttons restored to the top flap after a night of drying. The first 5 miles passed without incident. The landscape was open farmland, the river our corridor, the banks low enough to see approaching threats from a distance. We saw infected twice lone figures standing in a soybean field a quarter-mile east, motionless as a scarecrow, and a pair moving along a tree line to the west with the aimless drift Nora called dormant walking. None approached the water. The pattern held. At mile 6, Thomas stopped. He'd been scanning the eastern bank through a gap in the tree line, and now he raised his fist, a military gesture that seemed instinctive, and we froze behind him. "Smoke," he said. I looked. A thin column of gray-white smoke rose from behind a tree line half a mile east, too controlled for wildfire, too sustained for an accident. Someone had a fire. "Could be survivors," I said. "Could be a trap," Nora said. I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "In the movies, bad people use fires to attract other people and then take their stuff." Tomas and I exchanged a glance. She wasn't wrong. The post-outbreak world had layers of threat, and not all of them were infected. "We keep moving," I said. "It's not on our route." Nora nodded. Tomas nodded. We kept moving. But the smoke stayed visible for another mile, a question mark on the horizon, and I filed it under the category of things I couldn't afford to investigate. Mile 8 brought a new problem. The Scioto narrowed where a tributary joined from the west, and the combined flow deepened dramatically waist-high on me, which meant chest-high on Nora. She waded into it without complaint, but the current grabbed her pack and tilted her backward, and I caught her arm just before she went under. "I'm fine," she said immediately. The reflexive declaration of a child who'd spent 2 weeks proving she didn't need help. "I know you're fine, but the river doesn't care how fine you are. Grab my belt." She grabbed my belt. We waded through the deep section as a connected unit. Tomas ahead, breaking the current with his larger frame. Me behind with Nora attached. The three of us, a human chain in 40-degree water. It took 20 minutes to clear the confluence, and when the water dropped back to knee level, Nora released my belt without comment and resumed her independent position. But she walked closer after that. Not 4 feet behind me, 2. The concession was minor, and she'd never acknowledge it, but I felt the distance close and understood it as the first structural modification she'd made to her system since my arrival. She'd adjusted a parameter. The new parameter was trust. We walked. The sun tracked across a cloudless sky. The river carried us south through a landscape that looked exactly like Ohio had always looked: green, flat, agricultural, unremarkable. And if you could have stripped away the context, it would have been a hiking trip. 3 people walking through water on a spring morning, not speaking much, moving with shared purpose toward a destination they believed in. but you couldn't strip away the context. The context was everything. Zanesfield's Barricade appeared at 4 in the afternoon, exactly where I'd left it, 2 pickup trucks, nose to nose, the chain-link fence, the fire station rising behind it. I recognized it from a distance and felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. We'd walked 40 miles in 2 days through an occupied wasteland with a 9-year-old and a veterinary student, and we'd arrived. Bill Kessler appeared on the fire station roof before we reached the barricade. He saw me first, then Nora, and his expression performed a sequence I recognized: surprise, relief, assessment, caution. He climbed down and met us at the gap in the chain link. "You found her," he said. "She found herself. I just showed up." He looked at Nora. She looked at him with the same evaluating gaze she'd given me and Thomas. "Are there other children here?" she asked. "3. 2 boys and a girl. The girl's about your age." Nora nodded once. "Okay." She walked through the gap in the barricade and into Zanesfield with the matter-of-fact decisiveness of someone entering a building where she intended to be productive. Bill introduced Tomas and me to the community, 18 people, now 21 with our addition. There was a retired nurse named Helen who checked us for bites and signs of fever. There was a farmer named Dale who'd organized the food supply. There was a woman named Keiko who'd been driving from Dayton to visit her sister and had ended up here the same way I'd ended up in Kenton, by following someone's advice about water. The community was small, improvised, and functional. They had a rotation for watch duty, a shared meal system, and a rain collection setup that kept them in clean water. Nora toured the entire operation within an hour. I found her in the fire station's kitchen, talking to Dale about his food inventory system, which involved a clipboard and a pencil. She listened carefully, asked 2 questions, and then made a suggestion. "You should track what you eat each day, not just what you have. That way you can see how fast you're using things and know when you'll run out." Dale, a 60-year-old farmer who'd survived harsh winters and drought years and a wife's death from cancer, looked at this 9-year-old child and said, "That's a good idea." He wasn't humoring her. He meant it. That evening, the community ate together in the fire station's bay, canned vegetables, heated over a camp stove, reconstituted instant potatoes, and a jar of applesauce that someone had been saving. 21 people sitting on folding chairs and overturned buckets, eating in a circle, the bay doors closed against the darkening world outside. Nora sat between me and the girl her age, Lily, whose parents had brought her from Bellefontaine. They didn't speak to each other at first. Then Lily noticed Mr. Buttons protruding from Nora's backpack and said, "I have a bear." Nora said, "What's his name?" Lily said, "Captain Pickles." Nora said, "That's a good name." And they started talking with the instant, uncomplicated intimacy that children can generate from nothing more than proximity and a shared understanding that stuffed animals matter. I watched my sisters sit in a circle of strangers and talk to another child for the first time in 16 days, and I felt something I need to describe accurately because it's the center of everything. It wasn't relief, it wasn't pride. It was recognition, the same sensation you get when you look at a photograph of yourself from years ago and realize that the person in the picture is someone you no longer are. I looked at Nora and recognized that the version of Marcus who'd left Columbus the guilty brother, the rescuer, the man driving toward redemption through an act of salvation, no longer existed. He'd been replaced mile by mile by someone who understood that protection doesn't flow in one direction, that competence doesn't require age, that the strongest system in our group had been built by the youngest person in it. I'd gone back for my little sister believing I would save her. What I found was that she had already saved herself, and in showing me how, she dismantled every assumption I had about who I was and rebuilt it into something more honest. That's what changed me. Not the outbreak, not the walking, not the fear. Nora. Nora and her chalk circles, and her crayons, and her unshakable belief that if you watch carefully enough and write it down and follow the rules you make for yourself, the world, even this world, can be survived. She changed me because she proved that survival isn't about strength or weapons or experience. It's about methodology. It's about choosing to see clearly when everything invites you to look away. I sleep in the fire station now on a cot next to Nora's. She's adapted to Zanesfield the way she adapts to everything systematically, completely, without fanfare. She's mapped the barricade perimeter. She's started a weather log. She's teaching Lily how to do inventory tallies with colored pencils because Lily doesn't have crayons. I watch her and I see someone I almost didn't know because I was too busy not answering text messages and drinking beer on Wednesday evenings and telling myself I'd call on the weekend. The guilt hasn't left. I don't think it should. It's a useful signal, like the chalk marks Nora draws. It tells me where I've been and warns me not to go back there. I carry it the way she carries Mr. Buttons. Not because it fixed anything, but because putting it down would mean forgetting what it cost. I never found Mom. The thing Nora saw in Mrs. Abel's yard, the thing that looked like Mom but didn't move like Mom, is the only answer I have. And Nora and I don't discuss it. Someday we will, not yet. What I know now is this. I didn't go back for my little sister. I went back for myself. She was just the one who was ready when I got there.